chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Welcome, dear listener, to Fear from the Heartland. I'm your host, Paul J. McSorley. Set aside some moments now and take an adventurous ride on a journey into the psyche of some talented writers. They will dig into your being and titillate you. Oh, I love that word, titillate. While the stories may not all take place in the Heartland, I am delivering them to you from the Heartland. My intention is to strike fear and confusion into the mind, soul, and yes, the heart. This is Fear from the Heartland. Hello, Heartlanders, and welcome to episode 4 of Fear from the Heartland. I'm your host, Paul J. McSorley. My producer says I can't use titillate in these segments. You already use it in the opening for the show. Titillate, titillate, titillate. There, I'm good for a while. Sorry about that. A couple of interesting tales tonight. The first deals with the premise of insects taking over. I got on the old Google machine and found out there are an estimated 10 quintillion insects on the globe. That's 10 with 18 zeros following it. A smart lady entomologist from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln said so. And I believe her. I mean, it was on the internet. The second story tonight deals with parallel universes, multiverse, if you will. Throw in a super collider, and we have some real brainiac stuff going on. I've wondered at times, when entering the padded room, if I've not entered a parallel dimension. Who's to say I've not? A special thanks to Eli Pope and J.C. Fields authoring our stories tonight. Let's get after it. A story from the past meets today's current times. This one will make you think, what if? This story will take you from thoughts of childhood play to possibilities of different worlds and how they may operate together. An ending you won't expect, but will have you questioning, what if? And now for your indulgence, the Firefly Wars. One. Tommy ruled. He was the commanding pilot you could count on when the ship went down. And believe me, it was always going down lately. We had had more skirmishes in the last week and suffered more losses than I can remember. The weekends seemed to bring more casualties. I can't lie, I'd seen too many good pilots get pile-driven into the earth and soil caused by the enemy's latest weaponry. My name is Rod, First Lieutenant Rod Gibson, or Glow Rod, my nickname. But back to the air battles. Boom, one after another, pilots went spinning to the ground. Whack! Another 2 or 3 across the sky would go tumbling end over end in a twisted bolt through the clouds. This was almost every night. Tommy wasn't scared, though. He seemed to love it all. It didn't matter. He was golden whenever he was called to duty. He shined with excitement. Things would be a lot different if our squadron had 30 more of him. Other pilots fell apart when the heat was on after watching other pilots somersault from the sky. Tommy lived for this shit. He was always the first up in the air and the last pilot to put feet back on the ground. Tommy never had to buy his own drink at the bar after an air assault. He always got laid. The females loved him. They would always be signaling for him any action he'd want. Tommy was our ace, and all the other officers respected him. Hands down. Hell, we all wanted to be Tommy. No one more than me. This latest clash was sanctioned. Enemy combatants instigated the engagement with ground-to-air assaults. Captain Tommy J. Lampine led the 1st Squadron on recon to get the coordinates for an offensive strike. The time was 1900. Our FOB, Forward Operating Base, could be in jeopardy. The ground assaults were occurring in close proximity. The enemy seemed to have heavy equipment in the area and were using heavy artillery. Too far inland for the Navy to give aid. It was up to Airboys and Light Attack Squadron 4 to aid the infantry into the areas safely. Stingers would be called in when the coordinates were established of the enemy's command posts. Tommy flew in close to one of the assault units, and that was when the reality of what they were dealing with hit. He signaled and radioed to his squadron. "They aren't artillery guns. They're some kind of life forms." The second in command, Captain Elroy, responded, "Come back again, Tommy? What do you mean, life forms?" "This isn't military machinery like I've ever seen. These are living life forms of some kind. No visible form of armor. We need to call in the Stingers. Immediately, to my coordinates." "Hang tight, Tommy. I'm off your starboard wing and coming in for a look-see." With that, Elroy buzzed by and wove around the obstacles at just above ground level. 2. The neighborhood was about to become abuzz with the gang. It was that time when the sun was beginning its drop into the horizon for the night. The cicadas would begin their chatter, and then soon the little flashes of light would start to twinkle with yellowish-green spots throughout the evening air. Cooper Osborne was growing bored with the usual games of hide-and-seek. The kids from the block always gathered around 6 in the evenings to play, talk, and goof around. It was summer and school was out. Time for growing friendships, and now that he had just celebrated his birthday and become a teen, it was time to think about girls. Jenna had caught his eye from out of nowhere. Cooper didn't understand it yet, but suddenly she'd made him feel differently. He had known her from the neighborhood and school since forever. "Hey, Jenna, I'm tired of the usual hide-and-seek. How about you?" Cooper sat down on the concrete top of the picnic table as they waited for more of the gang to show. Jenna scooted onto the bench, onto the other end of the table, but not too far. Cooper looked out across the darkening playground, past the lampposts lining the pathway through the middle of the park. He smiled. The glowing yellow streaks of the lightning bugs began their nightly flash, on and off throughout the dark grounds scattered between the trees. "Wow, seems like more than last year." "What?" Jenna questioned. "The lightning bugs. There's millions of them this year. I think they're taking over the world. It's cool looking, you know? The way some flash on slowly and others look like tiny strobe lights. I always wondered what it means. What do you think they're signaling to each other?" "Well," Jenna began to blush. She was glad it was probably too dark for Cooper to see her face redden. "I always heard it was males looking for their mate." Jenna smiled as she looked down to the ground, her face becoming red, but difficult to see because of the twilight hour. Cooper laughed out loud, coming back with a typical teenage boy's response. "Lighting your tails to get laid. Now that's funny." He stared at Jenna, hoping she would look up so he could see her embarrassment. She turned away as if she was about to leave. "Hey, Jenna, look. What's this light coming out of my butt?" He laughed out loud with uncontrolled chuckling. "Oh, Coop, I'm just reminding you what science class taught us. But if you can make your butt glow, I want to see that." Jenna looked up, giggling. Cooper spied Nick and Braden off in the distance and quietly guffawed. He really wanted more time alone with Jenna, especially with the funny bug mating comments they had just begun to share. He glanced over and said, "Here comes Big Braden and Notorious Nick." Jenna turned and looked over her shoulder towards the two boys. Cooper saw what he deciphered as a tiny look of disappointment in her eye at the sight of them. His heart suddenly warmed with the thought of her saddened display as the gang interrupted their alone time. "Hey, Coop, Jenna, what's up?" Nick asked. Braden guffawed and punched Nick in the bicep. "Looks like Coop was trying to make time." Braden laughed again with zest and motioned his pointer finger in and out repeatedly of the circle made with the thumb and finger of his other hand. Nick too burst out in laughter at Braden's gesture. "Come on, guys, cut that shit out. We're just waiting on you losers to get your mama's chores done." Jenna cracked a smile. She looked over their shoulders and saw several more of the neighborhood friends heading into the park. Nick quickly answered Cooper. "Actually, I'm late because I was satisfying your mama since your dad can't anymore." He laughed and jabbed Braden back in retaliation. "Looks like the gang is almost all here. What are we going to do tonight?" Jenna asked as she slid her hands underneath her legs to keep them from nervously shaking, attempting to redirect the conversations away from the nasty boy talk. Paul stepped up to the table from the opposite direction they were all looking. "I got an idea," he said with an evil grin, his hand holding a wiffle ball bat. "Yeah, what's that, Paul?" Cooper sat up as Paul reached the end of the cement picnic table. "What's the bat for? Too dark to play ball, and I bet the girls won't want to play anyway." Paul smiled again. "Firefly Wars," he boasted as his voice cracked. Everyone laughed except for Cooper. "Firefly Wars? What the hell is that?" Cooper asked. "Just watch." Paul walked out into the darkness and a moment later laid the plastic ball bat over his shoulder and took a batter's stance. "Here, batter, 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 swing." He swung his bat briskly, and a small ball of light flew end over end until it tumbled from the sky, disappearing into the grass. He walked over after looking around at the ground for a couple of seconds, and then bent over, picking something up. His back was to everyone, and they watched intermittently between looking at each other with eyes wide open, and then back to their new friend Paul, who had just knocked a harmless firefly from the sky and was now standing over his kill. Paul's hand went from in front of him and then up to his head. He suddenly turned around and there was a streak of yellow glowing light smeared across his forehead from one temple to the other. "Firefly Wars! Haven't you guys ever played before?" Jenna was the first to yell out. "Ew, that's freaking gross, Paul." Cooper laughed. "So that's what you did in Arkansas for summer fun?" Paul began walking towards the table everyone was sitting or standing around. "Yeah, Cooper. Well, that and this." Paul's hand shot out in front of him like a lizard's tongue, grabbing a fly for dinner. Then he dropped his bat and tore the backside of the lightning bug's body off and stuck it on one of his fingers. "They make cool glow rings, too." It wasn't long before all the boys were looking for sticks to swing while Jenna, Kaylee, and Sharon sat on the bench seat with the look of disgust across their faces. The dark area between the trees suddenly became a war zone, filled with flying and toppling lightning bugs falling all around them while some of the boys would smear their glow juice on their arms, legs, and faces, like war paint. The early evening hours in the dark park had become a war zone. The girls turned their backs in disgust and talked about boys. They each began to feel differently about their thoughts of liking them in ways they had never noticed until recently. "I was actually beginning to have a crush on Coop." Jenna blushed. She looked behind them and saw the flying bug carnage he had ravaged by the amount of yellow glow smeared across his face. "I'm afraid he's not ready for the same feelings that I was having. He's obviously still too immature." They could hear the boys yelling and laughing, giving each other kudos on the great hits they had performed along with the amount of kills they were priding themselves with. They each were glowing from head to toe. Cooper stopped for a second and looked over to the table that the girls were sitting at moments ago. It was empty, and the silhouettes of 3 bodies were walking out of the park and into the street. "Hey guys, there go the girls." "Who cares? Watch this twofer." Paul swung his bat swiftly, and 3 tiny balls of greenish-yellow glow bugs flew up in an arc and then fell swiftly to the grass. "How the hell about that?" There was a sound of a bell ringing. "I gotta go, guys. Mom's calling for dinner. You gonna be back out later tonight?" Braden asked. They all nodded in agreement. Nick laughed out loud. "Hell yeah, I'm gonna bring my bat too. I've never had so much fun." 3. Jenna sat at the table, moving her food from one side of her plate to the other. She had hardly eaten a thing. Her mother took notice and was quietly keeping a watchful eye on her daughter before she could no longer hold her tongue. "Jenna, honey, it's not like you to eat so little. What's wrong?" Jenna looked up from her plate, appearing as if she wanted to talk, but was leery to answer. "It's okay, sweetie. It's just me and your father here. Bobby's too young to know what we're talking about." "I was just wondering," she glanced at her baby brother Bobby and then to her dad before turning back to her mother. "Do you think lightning bugs have souls? Do they have families that share dinner and nests or homes like we do?" "What in the world make you think of a question like this? Is this what's got you not wanting to eat your supper?" her mom asked her. "Well, Paul, the new kid from Arkansas?" Jenna fidgeted in her seat, appearing to become more nervous. She didn't want to get anyone in trouble. "Well, he came to the park tonight and he asked if we had ever played Firefly Wars. None of us knew what he was talking about." She looked slowly over to her dad, who appeared to have an idea where her questions were leading. "Anyway, he brought a wiffle ball bat and he walked out and swung it and knocked a lightning bug from the sky to the grass." Jenna saw her dad begin to smile slightly. "He walked over to it and pulled its body apart and smeared its guts across his forehead, and it glowed." Her mother looked over to her husband. "Oh my, I thought that game died with the kids our age." "I don't know about souls and families with fireflies, but I have to admit, honey, as a kid back in my day," her father coughed and cleared his throat, "we didn't have phones and PlayStations and whatnot. We had to come up with entertainment on our own to keep us out of trouble." "Well, I think it's cruel and disgusting. So do Sharon and Kaylee. I was beginning to think I liked Coop, but he just jumped in and began knocking the fireflies from the sky along with the others." Jenna took her napkin and wiped the corner of one eye. "I'm just not sure I'll see Cooper in the same light now." Jenna's father cleared his throat again. Jenna, just remember this. Boys are either no good at your age or up to no good." He looked at Kate, Jenna's mom, and nodded, then smiled. "It'll be okay, Jenna. While I agree we should respect all of God's creatures, with the exceptions of wasps, spiders, centipedes, and, of course, scorpions," Kate displayed a quick shiver. "While I think fireflies are beautiful, I don't believe God gave them souls or families like we know them as. It'll be okay, honey. And I think Brenda Osborne's boy Cooper is a fine youngster heading into young manhood. I wouldn't worry too much. He is just a boy." "Do I have permission to leave the table and go back out? Everybody is meeting at the park again after dinner." Kate looked over for an agreeable nod and then said, "Be back inside by 10, sweetie." Jenna took her plate to the sink and rinsed it, stacking it in the dishwasher just seconds before Kate and Jim heard the screen door slap closed against the jamb. Jim looked at his boy Bobby and then to his wife. "I bet Bobby will be smashing fireflies in no time, just like this Paul boy from Arkansas." He chuckled. "Damn, you females are some tough nuts to crack." 4. Captain Tommy was spent. The battle had taken a lull for about an hour, but he knew the night wasn't over. He had seen more good pilots get taken out this early evening than he had seen in a long time. He himself encountered several close calls. Sure enough, the life forms had now returned and were fighting even harder during this second scourge. One of his best friends and pilots was taken out before his eyes. First Lieutenant Eddie Beatles, the squadron's newest rookie, had been knocked from the sky and sent spiraling into the ground, only to be retrieved by the enemy and smeared across its armored shell. It was personal now. Others were being nabbed in midair and being secured in clear holding containers, practically stacked on top of each other and then placed in open sight as if to intimidate any of our brave pilots who circled past. "This is Squadron Leader Tango Oscar Mike Yankee. I have coordinates for Wasp Squadron Sierra Tango India November Golf Echo Romeo. Come back," Tommy called in and signaled coordinates to the Stingers bringing the Death Squadron inbound, even though it was outside their normal hours of engagement. These sons of bitches would soon reap their just desserts for the carnage they had brought on. This thought certainly resounded loudly inside Tommy's brain as he tail-signaled what was left of his squad. It was time to pull back and circle above, watching the Stingers move in and deliver their revenge. War was never pretty, but justice would most certainly bring a feeling of joy. A tear for his comrades who had given all, paying their ultimate price, and for those POWs who were now captured and held captive to the cruel invaders who had drawn first blood. Ground troops were being assembled and would soon rain a hell of its own brand on these bastards. Tommy was circling high above when he felt his craft shudder. His wings began to shake and quiver. He suddenly had no power and very little control as his nose began to dip downward towards the ground. "Glow Rod, this is Tommy." He tried to hold his nose level, but he now assumed he had been hit or suffered wind damage from the last assault he believed he had narrowly escaped. "Glow Rod, my wings feel like they're being pulled off. No control, and my gyro is haywire. Altimeter spinning like a thin reed in a tornado." Tommy's craft nosed up slightly, but his wings folded back and fell into the death spiral. "Mayday! Mayday!" Glow Rod witnessed his friend's last moments before he disappeared into the depths of the dark green blades of grass. He circled again, keeping his eyes peeled for the wreckage so he could call in the evac and medic teams. As he circled for the third time, he spotted the faint glow in the underbrush. He tapped his wing to acknowledge to his friend, so if alive, he'd know his coordinates had been signaled. "Hang in there, Tommy. Evac team is on its way. Godspeed, good buddy." 5. Jenna sat watching her friends. She almost wished she had just stayed inside. How could these boys, she thought she knew, be so cruel? Could she really fall for a boy who smeared bug guts across his face and body? She shook her head. "Oh, Coop, please stop." She looked at the jar sitting at the end of the table. It glowed on and off from the multitude of Firefly bodies climbing over one another, seeking a way of escape. And there she sat, a small tear pushing its way from each of her eyes. She was glad she sat alone, her girlfriends choosing instead to remain inside and be oblivious of what young boys found pleasure in doing. "I don't really know you, Paul, but I think I hate you now for what you brought from Arkansas to this once compassionate town of Eagles Point, Missouri." She leaned to her left, and one of her tears spilled onto the top of the concrete picnic table, landing beside the overloaded jar of the boys' captives. She sat watching the light show and wondering if those inside the jar were suffering, suffocating, or screaming out in agony in sounds she was unable to hear. Jenna turned her head with a quizzical look in her eyes. She had heard something. Jenna's head tilted one way and then the other, much like a puppy would do when it heard a high-pitched noise and then worked deciphering where it had come from. She discerned a high-pitched buzz, but was unable to detect the direction it came from. It was getting louder, though. It was almost as if the hum surrounded her from all directions. She looked back at the prison jar and saw something unexplainable. Cooper and the other boys were running around the open area of darkness, bodies glowing from all the bug guts smeared on each of them. Their bats were swinging, and small green and yellow blobs were spinning through the air, sprinkling down to the ground like wet drops of rain. The boys laughing and cheering each other on, yelling out the number of kills each of them held. All Jenna could do was shake her head as she felt her feelings for Coop fall, which mirrored the Firefly bodies twisting to the ground. Love was no longer in the air she had begun to breathe in earlier in the evening when she was alone with Cooper. He fell so easily into a heartless, cruel boy she had not seen before. She turned back to the jar just in time to see that all the bugs had climbed to the one side of the jar closest to the edge of the table. Not a single glow from their tails. It looked like they had concentrated their collective movements into rocking the glass jar back and forth until it now teetered on the edge of the crevice. It toppled over and crashed in a loud clatter, exploding into pieces when it hit the concrete pad below. She caught the scene from the corner of her eye and screamed loudly from fright, drawing the attention of the boys just 30 feet away in the dark opening of the trees. For an instant, there were no more glowing bodies flying willy-nilly through the air. Not a single blinking light from a firefly anywhere in sight. Just silence, except for a resounding or reverberating buzz becoming louder by the second. Jenna leaned to her left and peered over the table's edge. She saw lightning bugs begin to flutter their wings and take flight into the air and then hover out into the darkness, showing nary even a quick blink of a glow. There were several of the winged bugs that lay motionless in the shards of glass. Glow juice leaked from their bodies, a gleam that was magnified throughout the reflections of the glass pieces which covered them. Jenna didn't understand what was happening, but she felt and feared the unusualness the moment carried. The loudness quickly became overpowering in its unbearable racket. Jenna lifted her hands to her ears and cupped them, muffling the paralyzing static which preceded the moving darkness which surrounded them in a dark circling cloud. 6. Cries of panicked fear and pain began emanating from the area the boys had seconds ago been playing their war game on the Fireflies. The anguished shouts of terror were piercing in intensity, shattering through the buzz and whirs of the fog encircling the park. Jenna couldn't imagine what was happening before her eyes. She tried to focus on Cooper and the others, but the area was an intense blur of unfamiliar movement. She thought she saw the swing of baseball bats being swung as they cut through the haze momentarily that filled her field of vision. A hushed calm fell over the area mere seconds after the mayhem began. Jenna visually searched the opening in the park where the boys were last seen. She stood up from the picnic table and nearly fell back to her seated position from a nauseous dizziness. Jenna held a look of baffled shock as she looked back down at the broken jar on the ground and then back to the empty scene in front of her. She eventually focused in on several large dark clumps spread out across the grass. Still no movement or fireflies lighting the area. Advancing cautiously toward the clumps with momentary glimpses upward to the empty moonlit sky, she cautiously knelt at the first mound she came to. There beside it lay a plastic wiffle ball bat. She turned on the flashlight app on her cell phone and then positioned and pointed it to the last spot she had seen Coop swinging his bat. She gasped in horror as she touched the mass that now lay in the grass as she brushed away a clump of lightning bugs from what appeared to be an arm. The bugs were alive, motionless, but grouped side by side, covering the entire body as if attempting to keep it hidden. The bugs made no visual attempt to retreat or advance when she had carefully whisked them to the side. The body's skin appeared to be swollen and bright red in about every area that was exposed to her sight. Small pricks or sting marks surrounded by white rings appeared to be everywhere as the bugs covering the encapsulated body began to slowly light up in a greenish-yellow luminescence when touched. She didn't want to, but she moved her hand towards the spot she assumed would be the boy's face. Jenna gently brushed the wing-glowing beetles from the body's eyes and cheeks, moving her hand carefully across its entire face. Her eyes could no longer keep the tears from spilling down onto the undisturbed bugs, which remained quiet and somehow reverent in the moment. It was Coop's face. His eyes remained open, unmoved, and hollow, empty and expressionless. It was obvious the life inside was gone. He was barely recognizable from the bloated bright red bumps that had begun to ooze a clear liquid mixed with blood. She got up and went through the same motions with the other mounds scattered around grounds, 4 in total. Each appeared the same as the one before. Jenna returned, still in a baffled daze, to where Coop lay, still 3/4 covered by the silent, motionless fireflies, but now all lightly glowing. She knelt down again and leaned over, close to his ear, and whispered in a hushed tone, "Oh, Coop." She brushed more of the lightning bugs from his hand and then clasped his fingers intertwined within hers and squeezed. "Coop, damn it, why? I was falling in love with you. Why?" Tears flowed as she sniffed and cleared her throat. "How will I ever explain what I've witnessed? No one would ever believe me." Not 10 feet away from where Jenna was seated, the ground troop of ants maneuvered around her and worked their way toward the coordinates that Captain Tommy Lampine had signaled just before he nosedived into the deep grass. Jenna was so submerged in her one-sided conversation with Cooper, she never saw the platoon of medevac ants lift Tommy's body up and carry him from the crash site. After they cleared the area and arrived at the evacuation site, the entire squadrons of Fireflies collectively straightened their legs into takeoff position and gently lifted off in unison. Jenna sat up straight and watched as thousands of Fireflies ascended in silence, their tails beaming in varied colors from green to reddish yellow. Once they hit an elevation of about 10 feet, the glowing cloud veered to the west and slowly flew away into the distance, leaving a quiet battlefield behind as their medevac ants began their toll of picking up the rest of the dead and wounded. This skirmish was over. I was fairly new to battle at this time, nowhere near as experienced as Tommy. I was an old dear friend of his, though. He had convinced me that I had what it took to be a forward air controller in the 1st Forward Air Squadron, Light Attack Squadron 4, Lima Alpha Sierra 4, stationed out of Eagles Point, Missouri. I spoke at Captain Tommy Lampine's funeral and retold the story of the Play Hill Park skirmish that stole Tommy's life and career long before it should have. We all completed our mission with bravery, skill, and determination. Captain Tommy J. Lampine has a bronze statue along with an encased medal of valor placed at the last site he lived to show honor and pride in his actions to save our citizens from the carnage brought on by the foreign life forms. The last thing I'll say is if you are ever in the area of Play Hill Park, you'd better be there to pay homage to our hero. If you attempt to desecrate the statue tribute erected in his memory, you'll not only face the full military of our Arthropoda species, you'll have to contend with my wrath, Lieutenant Colonel Rod Gibson, better known as Glow Rod. When you look out to the fields of blinking lights, you bet the one that will be me is the one within striking distance of your ass. Remain vigilant, because I have my eyes on you, my target crosshairs sighted, and the balls to go to war with any son of a bitch that challenges. Godspeed, Tommy. I have your back. I sure hope you enjoyed tonight's tale, The Firefly Wars, written by Eli Pope. Eli Pope is a major writing contributor for Fear from the Heartland. Eli began his love of creating stories back in high school creative writing classes. The passion lay dormant for decades, while life took him different directions. The stories never left, and he finally succumbed to the voices in his head, telling him to put them on paper. And put them on paper he did, earning the Literary Titan Award for The Judgment Game and The Spark of Wrath, books 1 and 2 of the Mason Jar series, which you, dear listener, can hear on audible.com, performed by yours truly, Paul J. McSorley. The only thing I will tell you, Billy J. Cater is a bad dude. You can hook up with Eli Pope at his website, elipope.com. That's Eli, E-L-I, Pope, P-O-P-E.com. He can also be located on Facebook at author Eli Pope, or search groups on Facebook, The Mason Jar Room. Yesterday's Tomorrow was written by award-winning author J.C. Fields. According to quantum mechanics, multiple states of existence for tiny particles are possible at the same time. However, when one of these particles is actually observed, we see only one of its states. Thus, the possibility of multiple universes, or as they are more commonly referred to, parallel universes, might exist. As humans continue to push the boundaries of physics, someday we may discover the truth about our universe and whether we coexist with other parallel ones. In 1987, construction began on the superconductor supercollider. The project would have built the most powerful particle accelerator in the world, colliding high-energy protons in an attempt to discover the primary particles of physics. The SSC's ring was to be 54 miles in circumference, circling the small town of Waxahachie, Texas. 30 miles south of Dallas. They designed the facility to have 20 times the collision energy of any existing or planned machine. In 1993, the United States Congress canceled the project. What would happen if, someday in the future, the project is completed? May we offer, for your indulgence, yesterday's tomorrow. I do not remember the exact date I started noticing the changes. At first they were small. A missing pen, a strange fob on my keyring, a TV left on a station we never watched, and other weird stuff. The first time I mentioned one of the incidents to my wife Lori occurred when I found a book I had never seen before on my nightstand. "Hey Lori, is this your book?" She walked into the bedroom. "What do you mean is that my book? You bought it a week ago, silly." "I've never seen it before." Crossing her arms, she growled, "Brandon Nelson, do not call me a liar." I turned to her. "Honestly, I've never seen the book before." Her scowl softened. "You bought it last week. You've been waiting for months for it to be published." "I have?" "Yes, dear." She snuggled up to me and gave me a kiss on the cheek. "You've been working too hard lately. Ever since that super collider went online, you've been preoccupied." "I guess that's it. I'm just getting old and forgetful." She smiled and patted me on the arm. "Older, yes. Forgetful, no." I think Lori correctly assessed my preoccupation. I'm an electrical engineer with a master's degree working on a hush-hush project for the Department of Energy. Originally approved by Congress and President Ronald Reagan, the superconductor super collider began construction in 1987. Located 30 miles south of Dallas, only 22 miles of the planned 54-mile circular tunnel were built. Massive cost overruns triggered Congress to pull the plug on the project in 1993. Now, 40 years later, just like space exploration, a private company took over and finished the project with the stipulation the government would lease it back for 50 years. Actually, all I do is resolve problems with the massive electrical circuits of the giant particle accelerator collider buried under the plains of central Texas. By the last half of the century, the DOE started authorizing projects for the now completed facility. Lori and I have been married 15 years. We moved to the Dallas area 5 years ago when she obtained the position of history professor at Texas Christian University and I worked on the collider's construction. We both have advanced degrees and still find it hard to make ends meet. So I don't know if we will ever have children. We've tried, but with the current state of the economy and the transient lifestyle individuals with our credentials have to lead, it's not a great environment for little ones. I'm not a physicist, but I hear things. The words antimatter and dark matter were being thrown around, and I have witnessed a few high fives over the course of the past several months. I started noticing the small changes I told you about earlier during this time frame. Then came a Monday in late November. An experiment conducted by a team of physicists from Sweden occurred over the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. Lori and I left Dallas on the Wednesday before for one of our infrequent visits to her mother's house in Tulsa. Nothing out of the ordinary occurred during our get-together, other than a weekend spent listening to her brother enlighten us on how wonderful and intelligent his kids were. One of the reasons our trips are infrequent. Babies are a sore subject with Lori. On the Monday morning following our return, I sat in my cubicle going over the upcoming week's maintenance and upgrade schedule when a man appeared at my desk. I had seen him off and on over the course of the past year. His name was Ed Malone, and he worked in the power department. "Hey Nelson, I need you to check with the fabrication department today. They're having issues with the modification demanded by DOE. I looked up, smiled, and said, "Okay, did Aaron authorize it?" Malone frowned. "Aaron? Who the hell is Aaron?" Aaron Haney, the head of my department. "You okay, Nelson?" I nodded. Malone shook his head. "Not sure what you've been smoking, but Aaron Haney's been gone over a year. I took his place." I froze. A chill went up my spine and my stomach clenched. Not sure what to say. I think I mumbled, oh yeah, sorry." He handed me a file and shook his head. "These are the specs the Caltech wants implemented for their scheduled procedure next month. Go get a cup of coffee, get your head out of your ass, and head over to fabrication. You need to be there by 9. I sat at my desk for a few moments, not sure what to think. I turned back to my computer and opened an organizational chart for the facility. After staring at it for over a minute, I noted the last update occurred over a year ago. I could not find Aaron Haney anywhere on the chart. Edward Malone's name appeared where Haney's name had been last week. I know because I looked up the name of another supervisor on Tuesday the 23rd so I could send an estimate to the right department. I distinctly remember Aaron's name on the chart. I swear it. With no one else to ask, I called Lori. "This is a surprise. You never call me at work." "Who's my supervisor?" "Is this a joke, Brandon?" "No." She stayed quiet for a few moments. "Ed Malone. Did something happen to him?" A sense of vertigo struck as I struggled to push back on the panic I felt. My mind went blank as I stared at the cubicle wall, not seeing the memos or diagrams pinned to it. I must have been quiet too long because Lori said, "Brandon, are you still there? Did something happen to Ed?" "Nah, he's fine." "When did Aaron Haney leave?" "Over a year ago. Are you sure you're okay? What's this all about?" "Nothing. Guess I got confused. Sorry to bother you." I ended the call before she could say another word. I leaned forward and pressed my palms against my eyes. What the hell is going on? I really don't remember much about the rest of the day. The inconsistencies of that Monday were soon forgotten as I concentrated on a major upgrade requested by Caltech for the acceleration process. The upgrade took 7 engineers in our department 30 days to finalize. During this period, I worked 14-hour days, rushing home occasionally to grab a few hours of sleep and spending precious moments with Lori. Once we completed the upgrades, we on the engineering team were invited to witness the first test run. After the procedure ended, I felt underwhelmed. As I watched the main computer monitor, I saw a small squiggly line moving across at a steady pace. It suddenly hesitated, reversed course, and then disappeared. All of the physicists in the room went nuts. They began whooping and hollering, slapping high fives, and one guy even popped the cork on a bottle of champagne. I looked at Jonah. He's one of the guys in the engineering department. He looked back and shrugged. Jason, another colleague, stared at the computer screen with wide eyes. Jason is a level-headed kind of guy. If he seemed concerned, maybe I should be as well. I tapped the shoulder of the only physicist I knew by name and asked, "Eric, what just happened?" His smile could not have been wider. "Dude, did you not just see that?" "I saw a squiggly line reverse course and disappear. Is that important?" "Important? Dude, that was the most important discovery of the 21st century. We just confirmed Robert Mallet's theory of time travel." "How?" "You can't be serious. You didn't understand what you just saw?" I shook my head. He snorted, looked at the ceiling, and then back at me. "We just distorted space enough that a neutron went back in time. This is a monumental discovery. The implications to modern physics are huge. They're more than huge, they're..." He stopped and stared at the screen, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "This changes our theories of time, space, and the structure of the universe." He went back to celebrating with the other physicists. As I continued to stare at the computer screen, a feeling of dread coursed through my body. Excusing myself from the celebration, I walked back to my office through the access corridor. Halfway there, I felt a moment of lightheadedness, followed by a moment of intense cold. I stopped and looked around. I was completely isolated within the accelerator repair tunnel. No windows, no air conditioning ducts blowing cold air, nothing. I stood still for a few moments. A sudden wave of queasiness replaced the feeling of freezing. 10 minutes later, back in my office, I brought my computer back to life. I checked the time signature in the lower right corner. A few minutes after 10 p.m. I closed my eyes for a few moments and then went straight to my email files. What I saw there made me shiver more than the experience in the tunnel 15 minutes ago. The most recent email came from Lori, telling me our 9-year-old son, Zach, had won first prize at his school's science fair earlier in the evening. Several weeks after the confirmation of Mallett's theories, our department received a 3-day weekend to recuperate from the long hours of the previous 45 days. Adjusting to the routine of life with a 9-year-old happened without too much difficulty. I never mentioned the change to Lori. The whys and the how never asked. On the Friday of my 3-day weekend, with Lori at work and Zach at school, I looked through picture albums I had never seen. They were a chronological record of my marriage. Early pictures I recognized. The vast majority I did not. It felt like looking at someone else's life, only that someone happened to be me. I sorted through pictures of Zach as an infant, a toddler, his first day at kindergarten, his first day attending elementary school, and pictures of me and him in all kinds of fun-looking situations. None of which I remembered. How could I have forgotten 9 years of my son's life? I closed my eyes and started to sweat. The veins at my temples pounded as my heart raced. I felt my clothes sticking to me as I rushed to the bathroom and threw up. The success of sending a neutron back in time brought on a new set of complications. Everyone had to sign a standard Form 312 government non-disclosure affidavit. We were witnesses to classified information and threatened with prison if we disclosed details of any activities we observed at work. Jason refused to sign the form. 2 burly U.S. Marshals arrested him, and we never saw him again. With this new level of fear hanging over our department, morale took a dive. My mood darkened even further because of the changes I could not explain. I couldn't even talk to Lori about it. More experiments were conducted, generally at night. Those of us in the engineering department were never asked to witness another test. I made it a point to be away from work while these experiments were conducted. Surprisingly, I did not experience any changes during this period. 6 months later, they shut the accelerator down and called us into a meeting. The gathering occurred in the cafeteria with a standing room-only crowd. I arrived late and had to stand in the back, but I heard every word. The director of the project, Boris Yanovich, said, "Congratulations, team. Because of the success of this facility, it has been renamed the Mallet Super Collider. Our first full year has produced results no one expected or even envisioned. We have now been tasked with a newer and even bigger endeavor." A murmur could be heard from the crowd, as if everyone started having a hushed conversation with their neighbor. I looked around and saw everyone nodding their heads. "Since you have all signed your SF-312 form, I can tell you, we are going to expand the collider and make it even more powerful. Everyone's contract will be extended another 5 years. A cheer rose, and everyone started bumping fists and slapping each other on the back. I took a deep breath. While I had little evidence, the accelerator caused the changes I experienced. I had no other explanation. Lori's contract with the university would be up at the end of the semester, and we had made plans to move north. My current contract would end on the last day of August, 6 months from now. We wanted to move north before Zach started middle school. Strange how quickly I slipped into the parenting mode. His needs came first. I would contact Malone and let him know I would still be leaving at the end of my current contract. The sooner we left Dallas, the happier I would be. I quietly slipped out of the meeting and went back to my cubicle. Checking my email, I found an email from Lori. I read it several times before I leaned back in my desk chair and stared at the ceiling. She had been offered tenure at TCU. We would not be moving. August came and went. Zach started middle school. Lori became a full professor at TCU, and I immersed myself in the power upgrades to the Mallet Super Collider. As time slid by, the changes I experienced a year earlier seemed to fade, and my current situation became the norm. After continuously looking at pictures of my current life, memories started coming back. Not sure if I manufactured them or maybe, just maybe, I imagined a prior life. I began to hope and believe the former. Then February of the next year came. It occurred on the last Thursday of February the 22nd, if I remember correctly. I had planned on leaving early that day, but Malone stopped me as I exited my cubicle. "Nelson, glad I caught you. They need you in the control room in 15 minutes. "Why?" "New policy. They have to have a member of the engineering department in the control booth during experiments. You drew the short straw." "Again, why?" Malone frowned and started walking away. "Don't ask questions, just be there." I watched as he headed to the elevators near our department. He looked back at me as the doors opened. He gave me an expression I found hard to understand. It might have been a look of sympathy or disdain, I couldn't tell. But I will never forget it. After he left, I sat at my desk and my hands started to tremble. Closing my eyes, I seriously considered leaving the building. I felt sweat form on my forehead and my stomach clenched. I glanced at the clock on the wall. A thought struck me. Was Malone experiencing changes also? If so, his look could have been of sympathy and concern. I will never know. I never saw him again. I arrived in the control room 1 minute late. I didn't know any of the physicists, but I knew the supervisor. Shashi Rama and I had worked together on one of the major power upgrades 3 months earlier. I knew her to be a sharp, detail-oriented scientist with a deep understanding of quantum physics. She also happened to be one of the most beautiful women I had ever been around. As I entered the room, she smiled and walked over to me. As was her custom, she hugged me. I had noticed she did not hug other men, just me. "Thanks for coming, Brendan. We're running a few minutes behind." "Did you ask for me, Shashi?" She nodded. "You're one of the few people in the engineering department who understand the upgrades to our power system. The project you and I worked on last fall will be critical tonight. If we have problems, you'll understand the system and know how to fix it. I need you to go to section HB9. Even though Shashi came from India, she spoke fluent English. Her slight sing-song Indian accent was tinted with a slight Texas drawl. I found it to be just one of her idiosyncrasies I found attractive. The muscles in my stomach tightened. I could not think of anything to say except, okay. "Here, take this radio so we can keep in touch. If we see issues with the power, we can talk." I took the small radio and put it in my pants pocket. Cell phones do not function in the tunnel, and funds to install an intercom system have never been granted. It gave me a small bit of comfort to have it in my possession. Walking slowly at first, I took a deep breath and picked up my pace. It took 20 minutes to reach junction HB9. This particular section is one of the most isolated tunnels of the complex. I took the radio out of my pocket. "Shashi, I'm in position." "Excellent. We'll start with a 5-minute countdown." I pushed a button on my wrist chronograph, starting the stopwatch function. With a deep breath, I leaned against the wall opposite from the collider tube and slid down until I sat on the floor. My knees were together and I put my arms around them. As I closed my eyes, my whole body started to shiver. I felt utterly alone. Memories of the changes I had experienced a year and a half ago flooded back. I had not been present during an experiment since the night I found I had a 9-year-old son. While I still had not convinced myself the collider experiments were the cause, it seemed to be the only logical explanation. I opened my eyes and stared at my watch as the second hand swept toward the 12. 3 minutes, then 4 minutes. Finally, as the sweeping timing hand reached 12 the 5th time, I felt the collider tunnel slightly vibrate. I closed my eyes as vertigo encircled me. A mass of cold air settled over the area where I sat. The nausea returned, and I dipped my head until it rested on my knees. Knowing what would happen next, I sobbed like a small child. It felt weird driving on the left side of the road with the steering wheel on the right side of my car. It appeared to me to be the same car model, just different. As soon as I left the parking lot, I called Lori, dreading what she would tell me. She and Zach were fine. It seemed no other changes had occurred. After ending the call, I breathed a sigh of relief. I could deal with driving on the wrong side of the road. Even though I had only experienced being a father for less than 2 years, I did not want this reality to end. As I drove home, I made the decision to discuss the possibilities of the collider creating a bridge into parallel universes with Shashi. No specifics, just a what-if conversation. I did not want her to suspect I might be crazy. This thought gave me pause. I might actually need to consider this possibility. Very unlikely, Brandon. The energy needed to create the amount of distortion you are suggesting is beyond the means of this facility. Shashi smiled. But it is an interesting concept. Why do you ask? I shrugged. No reason. My mind wandered last night during the test. Not many engineers think like you do. Most of the ones around here just design or fix stuff. I've noticed you have a more... She paused. A more curious mind. Thank you. I felt a moment of guilt, enjoying my conversation with Shashi. My love for Lori was unquestionable, and I would never do anything to compromise our relationship. But if I could be tempted, it would be by this woman. Do you believe in parallel universes? She chuckled and shook her head slowly. It's not a matter of believing. Your question should be, does string theory and quantum physics predict parallel universes? The answer depends on your understanding. If you follow the many worlds interpretation, yes, there are infinite parallel universes. Could we access them? She shrugged. Once again, depends on your interpretation. If the cosmos is infinite, which quantum physics suggests, then the right distortion would allow access. What the correct distortion is, we have no idea at this stage of our learning. I just nodded, lost my own thoughts. Brandon, there must be a reason you're asking about this. Please tell me. I opened my mouth to tell her, but we were interrupted by Aaron Haney. Nelson, where the hell have you been? We have an emergency power surge in section HB9. Get down there immediately. My mind swam with the implications of seeing the man who had been my supervisor 3 years ago. Where was Malone, and why was Haney back? I guess I sat too long. Haney screamed at me. Get your butt going, Nelson. This isn't a drill. I spent the next 24 hours underground, coordinating repairs and software updates. When things calmed down, the rest of my team wearily returned to the above-ground office complex. I stayed to check our work one more time. Several minutes after they left, I felt the coldness and nausea. Already exhausted, fear gripped me as I leaned against a wall opposite the collider tube and started shaking uncontrollably. Perspiration ran down my face and dripped off my nose. At the same time, a below-freezing temperature surrounded me. At some point during this period, I lost consciousness. Unaware of how long I had been out, I managed to get to my feet and head toward an elevator. When I got to the surface, everything appeared normal. I saw no signs a near disaster had just occurred. I glanced at a clock on the wall near the elevators. 10 to 5. Had I really been in the tunnel since the previous morning? Nothing made sense until I remembered my experience in the tunnel. I walked as fast as I could to my office. Everything remained as I had left it the previous day. I grabbed my cell phone from the top right-hand drawer and dialed Lori's number as fast as I could. An old man answered and grumbled no one by the name of Lori lived there. He then abruptly ended the call. Standing there, I stared at the phone, my eyes not seeing it. Shashi appeared at my cubicle and interrupted my urge to scream when she gave me a long kiss on the lips. "Glad I caught you. Can you pick up Lori at daycare tonight? I have to attend a meeting and I don't think it will be over until 8 or so." The shock of her statement and the implications made my head swim. I placed a hand on the cubicle's wall to steady myself. Why would I need to pick up my wife at daycare? Why had Shashi kissed me so passionately? "What's wrong, Brandon?" I didn't answer. "Are you okay?" I just stared at her. She reached over and felt my cheek and then my forehead. "You don't look well, but you don't have a fever." I remained quiet. "You need to go home. I'll get out of the meeting and pick up Lori." Without saying a word, I nodded and headed toward the parking lot. When I got in my car, the driver's side was back on the left side. Knowing full well another shift had occurred, I sat staring out the front window with both hands on the steering wheel. I took out my cell phone and started scrolling through the pictures on it. The more I scrolled, the more terrified I became. All of the pictures on my phone were of Shashi and a 3-year-old little girl. I appeared in numerous shots hugging Shashi and the child. We were smiling and having a wonderful time. Times I never experienced. Lori and Zach were not in the pictures. I rested my head on top of the steering wheel as I looked down at the pictures on my phone. When I saw the last one, tears rolled down my cheek. The picture showed a headstone, the name Lori Nelson engraved on it. As the tears flowed, I stared at the date of the death on the marker. Lori had died 10 years ago. Luckily, the GPS unit in my car had my home address programmed. I followed it and found we lived in a large home in Arlington Heights. As I wandered through the strange house, I saw more pictures of Shashi, a little girl, and me. I discovered her name was Lori. Shashi had our marriage license framed and on the wall of a room I assumed to be our bedroom. We had been married 6 years. As with all other transitions, I had to go with the cards I had been dealt. I decided I would act exhausted for the next few days while I learned about my new reality. My grief of losing Lori and Zach faded over time as I adjusted to my new life. Shashi turned out to be a loving, caring wife and mother. From careful questioning and examining personal documents in our home office desk, I learned our daughter had been named after my late wife, who had been killed in a car accident 10 years ago. I discovered Shashi and Lori were close friends. As an honor to Lori's memory, we had named our child after her. I found out that Shashi had always had a crush on me, one she did not act on until Lori had been gone for several years. Like I have mentioned, I always liked Shashi. If my new reality is without Lori and Zach, being with Shashi and our daughter would ease my grief. I took a 2-week vacation after the averted disaster episode in my previous reality, an incident which had not occurred in this timeline. When I returned to the complex, I put in for a transfer out of the team which dealt with the collider tube. I told Shashi I didn't want to go into the tunnels ever again. My request drew questions and debate, but with Shashi's help, the director of the facility finally granted my request. Life with Shashi and our daughter grew routine and comfortable. Memories of Zach faded. In this reality, he had never been born, so all I possessed of him were cloudy memories. My new duties at the collider kept me out of the tunnel, and I made sure I left the premises when experiments were conducted. I never brought up the topic of parallel universes with Shashi again. After a while, my internal grief faded, and we settled into a loving and comfortable marriage. We watched our daughter grow and become a rebellious teenager and then a beautiful young woman. Memories of my shifting from one universe to the next became more of a thing of nightmares than conscious thought. 17 years to the date I discovered my marriage to Shashi, I had to go back into the tunnels. Alarms were sounding as I raced to Haney's office. He stood staring at a flat-screen TV with a chart of the collider represented by junction points. Shashi stood next to him, along with several physicists I didn't recognize. She turned to me and rushed into my embrace. Her eyes were wide and she trembled in my arms. Everyone in the room looked spooked. "What's going on?" My voice sounded hollow as I held my wife. Haney stared at the TV screen. We don't know. We have numerous breaches of the collider tube and no clear reason. I remained quiet. One of the new physicists scratched his chin and offered an opinion. We have an electrical spike in section HB9. It appears to be spreading to other sections. If this continues, we could lose the entire complex. Haney looked at me. You know this section like the back of your hand. Can you fix it? Considering I haven't been down there in 17 years and I have no earthly idea of what's wrong, I doubt it. Haney took a deep breath. Get down there and give us your assessment. I shook my head. No. Send someone who's been there recently. They're already in other areas doing the same thing. Realizing I might be the only person available to prevent a disaster, I made my decision. Shashi held me tight, not letting me go. I gently broke her embrace and kissed her. I'll be careful. She shook her head. Don't go. Brandon, please. I grabbed a radio as I walked out of the office, heading toward the elevators. When I emerged moments later, smoke filled the tunnel several sections from HB9. Breathing became difficult, so I stopped by an emergency station and took out an oxygen mask. As I got closer to HB9, I felt the nausea and cold return. A sudden realization flooded over me. I screamed into the mask. No, not again! I fell to my knees as these sensations, not felt in years, swept over me. The dizziness, nausea, and lightheadedness overpowered me. I keyed the radio and called for help. All I got in response was static. Loud, total static, as if the world had abandoned me. Just before I blacked out, I remembered seeing thick black smoke billowing around me. How long I lay there unconscious, I will never know. When I woke up, the emergency lights were out and total darkness prevailed. I had kept my cell phone in my pocket for some reason and used the flashlight function to illuminate the tunnel. Dust and cobwebs were all I saw. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, but from which direction I could not tell. My head pounded like I'd been on a 2-day bender, and my joints were so stiff I could barely walk. I ripped off the mask and keyed the radio again. It only emitted silence, no static or any sound at all. I noted the battery indicator showed 50% power. A sign next to me on the tunnel wall indicated an emergency exit lay several hundred feet behind me. Turning, I staggered toward it. When I arrived, I found the door rusted, slightly ajar and off its hinges. It would not open wider, so I squeezed into the stairwell and headed up. The absolute darkness gave me pause. Without the cell phone light, I would never have found the exit or been able to navigate the stairs. When I got to the main floor, sunlight filtered through holes in the ceiling. A fine gray powder covered everything. I had to wave my hand in front of my face to clear the air. The stairwell led to an area next to an exterior door, and I hurried outside to get away from the dust. What I saw sent chills up my spine. Overgrown weeds dominated the scene. Misshapen trees reclaimed the cracked concrete of the parking lot. Abandoned cars sat rusting on rims, their tires pieces of cracked, twisted black material. Dark clouds raced toward the east, and what sunlight I could see remained weak and filtered. I turned and looked back at the accelerator complex. Whole sections had collapsed, and the building appeared to be ancient. I heard neither birds, bugs, nor animals as I stood there, the silence deafening. The cold wind blowing out of the west stirred the dust covering everything. I bent down and ran my finger over the sidewalk. When I brought it up, the dust appeared white, like ash. I smelled it and immediately started coughing, my stomach retching. As a blister appeared on my finger, a sudden realization struck me. I had been thrown into a parallel universe where nuclear annihilation had been released on the world. I looked up at the ashen sky and fell to my knees. Turning to glare at the building, I shook my fist and screamed, "You did this! Damn you all to hell!" As a final darkness descended over me, breathing became difficult. My last thoughts were of Shashi, my lovely daughter. my dead wife Lori, and my long-lost son Zach. I hope you enjoyed tonight's story, Yesterday's Tomorrow, penned by J.C. Fields. J.C. Fields is an award-winning and Amazon best-selling author. He is a full member of the Missouri Writers Guild and is active in numerous other writing groups. His Sean Kruger series has won numerous awards, including multiple gold and silver medals in the Reader's Favorite International Book Contest. The Imposter's Trail was awarded Best Mystery Thriller at the 2017 Ozark Indie Book Fest. In March of 2020, his novel, A Lone Wolf, became a #1 Amazon best-selling audiobook. His second novel in the series, The Last Insurgent, became a #1 Amazon new release in January 2021. All of the aforementioned books can be found on audible.com, narrated by yours truly. If you'd like to learn more about J.C. Fields, you can reach out to him at jcfieldsbooks.com. That's jcfieldsbooks.com or bookbub.com/authors/J-C-Fields. You can also reach him at facebook.com/jcfieldsbooks. If you enjoyed tonight's story hosted by yours truly, Paul J. McSorley, you can search my name on Chilling Tales for Dark Nights on YouTube for additional previous stories. If you'd like to hear more lengthy tales, be sure to take a look at my audiobooks. Available now on audible.com or just visit paulsbooks.net. That's paulsbooks.net. You can also find me personally on Facebook and Twitter. And with that, listeners, our weekly journey into the psyche has just about come to a close. But before we go, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for joining us for tonight's episode and remind you to take a moment to stop by our iTunes page and leave Chilling Tales for Dark Nights a 5-star review and a kind word. And follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram if you haven't already. And of course, subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find an archive of our work going back to 2012. And consider signing up as a patron at our website, chillingtalesfordarknights.com, to show your support and get all of our content ad-free. I'm your host for Fear from the Heartland, Paul J. McSorley. I've enjoyed the titillation tonight. Ooh, there's that word again. Thank you for joining me. Hope to see you again next week at Fear from the Heartland.
Chilling Tales for Dark